Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is prophecy in the end of times. With me is Richard Smoley, who is author of The Essential Nostradamus. He is also editor of Quest, the journal of the Theosophical Society in America, and is the previous editor of Gnosis magazine. His many other books include The Dice Game of Shiva, How Consciousness Creates the Universe. Also, Inner Wisdom, the Guide to the Western Inner Traditions. Welcome, Richard.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I know you have many other books that I didn't go through the list, but we're going to focus now on the idea of the end of times and prophecy. And I think probably the essential point as I think about the idea of the end of days is that for the last 2,000 years, certainly since the days when Jesus walked on this earth, people have thought that the end of time was imminent.
Yeah, they have. In fact, I came across a website not so long ago that had a list of dates between then and now with the years marked that were supposed by somebody or another to be the end of time. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of them marked. So there's a desire to believe that this end of time is imminent. And this partly goes back to Christianity. And Christianity, there seems to have been a belief in the early days of Christianity that the end of time was imminent. Mm-hmm. Now, we know this because the first book of the New Testament to be written was Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. And one of the things he addresses in it is these people's fear about their loved ones who died before Jesus came back. Mm. Jesus was coming back real soon, so they were all going to be, part of the elect. But what about the people who died? And so Paul writes and says, the dead in Christ, that is to say those who are faithful, shall rise first, and then we shall all be taken up as in the twinkling of an eye. This, by the way, is the source of the rapture doctrine that so many fundamentalist Christians proclaim today. Mm-hmm. So there was a real intense belief. If you look at what's called the Apocalyptic Discourse in the Gospels, it's found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. They're all very much similar. Mm-hmm. What does it sound like? Well, it sort of sounds as if Jesus is predicting the sack of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans, to be shortly followed by the end of the world. Now, the first part of this prophecy did come true. Mm-hmm. That Jerusalem, the temple, was sacked by the Romans in AD 70.
Yes.
The end of the world didn't really quite come.
Not at all.
As they say, cats continue to go on having kittens. And the last book of the New Testament to be written is the second epistle to Peter, mm-hmm. which was not written by Peter, but was written probably 80 years after his death. And it's attempting to address all of these concerns about, hey, what about all these people who are saying these end times are here now, but they're not here? Mm-hmm. So by then, there was already, a real disappointment of apocalyptic expectation. Yes. And there's been cycle upon cycle of this kind of, mm-hmm. and every age is somehow thought to be the time that was prophesied. You can look, there's that famous verse in Matthew, there shall be wars and rumors of wars. Well, in fact, every age has wars and rumors of war. And every age sounds like that description because human life is tumultuous. Revelation seems to be saying, in its complex symbolism, that with the coming of Christ, Satan was thrown down to earth, and that he had taken form in this beast known as the Roman Empire, and that this was soon going to be put right too. And then there would be a new heaven and a new earth. Well, this didn't quite work out either. So the question then becomes, why is this so persistent?
Yes, there's a real market for these kinds of prophecies.
Exactly. And so then you have to ask what purpose the end times serve in the human mind. And there are several answers I would give, all of which are a facet of the thing. One is what the psychologists call displacement.
Okay.
And what that means is you have a fear that you can't handle, so you displace it onto something else that's a little bit more remote and that's a little easier to deal with. What fear can many people not handle? The fact that they're going to die.
Indeed.
You know, you're going to die in a few decades at the most, so am I, so is everyone else who's watching this, right?
This is the basis of existential philosophy.
Right. But, you know, it's just a fact.
It is a fact.
But no one really or many people do not like to think about this.
It's a difficult fact.
It's a difficult fact. So what you do is you displace this onto these end times, which, you know, quite frankly, you know, they're not going to work out the way that, you know, they say in all, you know, all these, you know, movies and books, because, you know, God is frankly not the creator of a B movie, in my opinion. And everybody kind of knows that, but it's safer to deal with their fears of death when if it's projected onto the end of everything than if it's the end of just me.
Yeah.
And then, of course, nobody likes to die alone, or, you know, no one seems to like to die alone. So the idea that it's all going to happen to us all at once, you know, at least gives it kind of a cozy cult feeling.
That's one interpretation.
That's one side of it. Now, there are others. One has to do with what is technically called theodicy. That is the justice of God.
Yes.
We all, human beings, all have a very strong inbuilt sense of what's right and wrong. Some, like sociologists and biologists have said that this is kind of our killer app. Our sense of fairness, our holding each other accountable is what made human cooperation possible to the extent that it's existed.
You can even see this sense of fairness in other animal species.
Yeah, apparently, though, in human beings, it's even more pronounced.
I'm not surprised.
And so naturally, we want to have the universe, as we understand it, to be fair, too. And if you look at things with some attempt at objectivity, yeah, you know, more than you like to admit, you know, most people get what they deserve most of the time. But there's always a little bit left over. There's always, you know, the equations just don't
There's
add
always
up.
somebody getting away with murder.
And, you know, somebody else, you know, being, you know, totally fried for no apparently good reason.
Yeah.
And one way the human mind has evolved or developed to deal with this is, in a sense, to put all the balancing at the end time, the reading of the book of life.
Right.
Well, there are all these accounts that haven't been
The reckoning.
reckoned.
Yes.
You know, and of course, and it is put in really actuarial terms, right?
Yes.
Reckoning. That is how divine justice is going to sort itself out. Now, the Eastern traditions don't think about these things as much because they have the notion of karma and rebirth.
Yes.
So if you know, had something terrible happen to you, it, you know, something to do with, you know, 2 or 3 lifetimes ago. This has problems in its own right, but they're not the problems we're talking about.
Right.
So this kind of theodicy, and there's this displacement. And the final thing is the anthropomorphic principle, the idea that you want to see, and we do see, the universe as a human being writ large,
Yes.
complete with a birth and death.
Mm-hmm.
And all the myths of the world, many of them, most of them, begins with creation or even the birth of the gods.
Yeah.
It ends in some kind of final conflagration, the Götterdämmerung of the old Germanic myths. And the Christian version, inherited from Judaism and Zoroastrianism, is the end times. So, our life is going to end, so the universe's life is going to end. It may or may not be that way, but these are three, I think, really strong reasons that the human mind tends to push in this direction. And what that will mean in the long run, I don't know. I don't, personally expect, the end of time to, occur. And what is the end of time anyway? Because if it's a thing in time, what was the end of time? January 5th, 2020. Well, that was the end of time. So what? There are things after that. Something must follow that. So time must still be around somehow.
Well, if all clocks are destroyed. But, it seems to me that this idea, this notion of the end of days is a very dangerous notion.
Yep.
For example, I think some people feel like we don't have to worry about the environment because the world's going to end soon anyway.
Yeah, and that's another kind of rationalization for this kind of exploitation and that kind of thing. We don't have to bother about it. This was, in a way, the mindset of Christianity for a long time because people really were expecting the time of the end. And it's really only since the 19th century with the discoveries of Lyell and Darwin and other scientists that realized, wow, this has been around for a lot longer than anybody dreamt of. And we have to shape our thinking accordingly, and it's not that easy to do because it's no longer quite understandable in a human time frame.
There's a fascinating sociological study, you're probably aware of it, by Leon Festinger, who wrote a book called When Prophecy Fails. I think it goes back to the 1950s or 60s perhaps. He studied a UFO cult that was predicting, once again, the end of the world on a particular date, and then it didn't happen. And he observed as a sociologist the various cult members. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them used the occasion of the prophecy failing to become even more fervent in their beliefs about the validity of their prophet.
Well, there is a tendency in the human mind, when your beliefs are threatened, to kind of really circle the wagons. And you could well ask how much of the current culture wars in America today are the result of people doing just that. People's worldviews are threatened, so they become that much more wedded to them, and they cling to them, in kind of a life raft sort of way. And that would explain a great deal about current social tensions. The fact is we live in a time of transition. And I think one thing that makes our time very, very different from a lot of others, that doesn't mean this is the end times, but it means it is a different time, is that we take change as A, something to be desired, and B, something at least present and always happening. I think not so long ago, you were a peasant, and you were a peasant, and kind of the way your ancestors were peasants 300 years ago. And yeah, there were some war, some crazy army would come through and burn the crops every now and then, but life kind of went on.
The notion of progress didn't necessarily exist for people whose lifestyle remained the same for generations.
Nor did the idea of change, progress, or deterioration. It was just, this is the way we've always farmed this land. It worked for Grandpa and Dad. It's working for me. By God, I'm going to knock my son in the head if he doesn't do it exactly the same way, and so on and so on. It worked in many contexts and a lot of different situations. Not that it was wrong. It's just that our situation is so different that many habits of the human mind haven't shaped themselves accordingly.
Well, Richard, you've made an extensive study of the prophecies of Nostradamus, as well as biblical prophecies, and there is this recurring theme of, great cataclysms are going to occur.
Yeah, and that is kind of the dilemma of prophecy, because there are two types of prediction possible. One is fairly standard futurological prediction.
Extrapolation of present trends into the future.
Yeah, if, current trends continue, the world by 2050 will have X number of people and, blah, blah, blah. And this is a legitimate thing to do. And the only thing they don't and can't take into account are the inevitable disruptions, because these things are always surprises. And these things will always kind of mutate the final result. So the futurologists can't really do that. I just say, well, look, this is my job. This is what the graph looks like. What am I supposed to do? The prophet, if the prophet went around saying everything's just going to be the way it is for the foreseeable future, no one would listen and no one would care.
Right.
They have a vested interest, at least, in entertaining their audience, and so all sorts of cataclysms are predicted and all sorts of disasters. And there are cataclysms and disasters, although somehow they never quite turn out when and how predicted.
But I think the human brain may actually be wired so that we want to be alert to potential disasters. For the tiger jumping out of the bush at us, and if somebody says, "Hey, there's a tiger there," we're going to pay attention.
I think one of the problems of the human mind is that, apparently like the other animals, we do have a sense of the future. The problem is that our sense of this future isn't too good. It's just good enough to make us miserable. It's just good enough for us to think of like all sorts of terrible things, some of which could conceivably happen, some of which are deluded fantasies. But the human mind kind of feels it has to plan for these somehow. But if you think about it, the bulk of these possibilities just get so great that it's overwhelming. And what ends up happening, I think, is a kind of generalized anxiety.
Well, don't you also see in the realm of prophecy the discussion of a new golden age?
Yeah. Well, again, it goes back to this notion of theodicy. There's a point at which when all the current injustices are set right, as they have to be if the cosmos is a just place, then everything will be great again. Now, sometimes this is portrayed in a cyclical way. Now, you mentioned the Golden Age. And these ages are often, going back to the Greek poet Hesiod, portrayed in terms of metal: the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age. He threw in an age of heroes in the Iron Age. We're according to Hesiod, writing in 750 BC, we're in the Iron Age, which is the worst and most miserable of all. And by the way, you go to India and, well, what are we in? We're in the Kali Yuga, which literally means the age of darkness, the worst of the four ages. There are four ages, and again, this is the worst one. The idea is at some point the age is going to turn. Now, in the West, the idea is this is always just around the corner. The Indians say, well, the Kali Yuga has 132,000 years, so let's not hold our breath. But there is this idea that everything will kind of revert cyclically, ideally to a time that's much, much better.
Certainly in Western culture, the concept of the age of Aquarius has caught on.
Yeah. And this is fascinating. I mean, I've taken a look at the astrological ages, and to sum it up briefly, there's the age of Pisces, which many people date I don't know. Let's simplistically date it from the time of Christ.
Which is why I understand the symbol of the fish is often connected to Christianity.
That's right.
Pisces being the astrological sign of the fish.
And Aquarius, the sign of the man, the water bearer, is coming around now. Now, there's no way of fixing, any sort of...
Exactly.
I have to say that in many ways we seem to be in the Aquarian age already. And the only reason people are missing out on it is that they thought it was going to be a golden age when it just turns out to be an age like any other. Aquarius is ruled by Uranus, which governs high technology. So all of this stuff.
Electronics.
Sometimes Aquarius is associated with homosexuality. And as a result, who 20 years ago would have thought that gay marriage would ever have been mainstreamed? And Aquarius is eccentric and individualistic, and people these days aspire to be eccentric and individualistic in a way that, 100 years ago, pretty much everyone wore the same suit, and the housewives all hung their wash out on Monday, and, if you didn't, you were weird. So, in some ways, this is it. It's just another age. Life goes on.
Well, I think, though, it's important to make this point, especially since you've made such a study of probably the most famous prognosticator in history, Nostradamus, and that is that after taking a very careful look, if I understand your writing on the subject correctly, and though there were some partial hits, basically the prophecies turned out to be non-existent or irrelevant or misinterpreted, that the idea that there has been some great prophet in the past who has been able to accurately, time after time after time, predict what will come to foretell the future, it's just a myth. There's no evidence for it.
Yeah, unlike most other writers on Nostradamus, I said this pretty much, I flatly stated this in the book, that I do not base any expectation of future events on anything Nostradamus prophesied or is supposed to have prophesied. So that is where I stand on it. Nostradamus is a fascinating figure anyway, and the uses of his prophecies, to my mind, are often more interesting than the prophecies themselves. I'll give you probably the most influential example. There is a figure in some of Nostradamus's prophecies known as Hister.
Oh, yes, very famously related to Adolf Hitler.
Yeah. And one of the first people to see this was none other than Eva Goebbels, wife of Goebbels, his propaganda minister. Eva Goebbels was really into the occult.
Yes.
Whether her husband was or not is another matter.
But many Nazis were.
Well, it was irrelevant because he was, unfortunately, a genius at propaganda, and he saw the uses of this.
Yes.
So he started using Nostradamus's prophecies and associating him with Hister, and the Nazis even published these books in neutral countries. I read one once that was published in Norway. It was in English. That basically was saying that Nostradamus was predicting that the end of the British Empire was 1939. The year World War II broke out. Now, this was faked. I mean, you could mold Nostradamus's prophecies to do this, but it was completely faked.
But in the history of looking at the prophecies or the quatrains of Nostradamus, there were any number of fakes.
Well, the Hister thing, just to bring it full circle, I think the reference is a lot more, shall we say, undramatic. Because what was the most powerful country in Europe in Nostradamus' time? That was the Habsburg Empire of Austria.
Yes.
What is the principal river of the Austrian Empire? The Danube.
Yes.
What is another name for the Danube? The Ister. Just add an H to make it a little... So he was talking about Austria. He was talking about the most important power of his day.
Uh-huh.
And it's much more reasonable to think he's talking about that than about some, figure, 300 years later, 400 years later. But what am I going to do? If I go on TV saying, well, this is really all about the Habsburg Empire in the 16th century, I mean, who's going to care?
But I think from a scholarly perspective, when we look at biblical prophecies or Nostradamus or Edgar Cayce, it's very important to see these prophecies in the context of the political, religious, historical turmoils of the time, because usually that's what they're speaking about.
Yeah, directly or indirectly. Or, to put it another way, their means of coping with the anxieties generated. Nostradamus' age was the 16th century, which was a time of incredible upheaval in Europe. For one thing, there were decades of bad weather, just cold, wet weather, which meant bad crops. In those days, bad crops wasn't like the price of bread goes up. It meant starvation. So there was a lot of the Reformation had taken place, and Europe was convulsed by these religious wars. Nostradamus got started doing almanacs because, like the Farmer's Almanac. And because farmers weren't sure about the weather, so they wanted some
There was a market.
And he started putting in these little predictions. And the almanacs haven't survived, and only a few of these early predictions did, but they were things like, this year Europe will undergo a change even from the very top to the bottom. Okay. You can, sure, yeah. It's not hard to fit events into a prophecy like that.
Yeah.
So they were very successful, and eventually he started doing these verses, and the story goes on from there. And they're cryptic enough, they're obscure enough that you can project them onto later events. In all fairness to Nostradamus, I will say that before 9/11, there were Nostradamus experts who were saying that Nostradamus predicted this aerial attack on New York. So it wasn't just an after formation, but they were predicting this before. Now, that particular prediction, to me, if you really want to analyze it, fire shall attack the great new city. Well, again, it's probably a little more banal than one might hope. New city was probably Naples, whose name Neapolis is Greek for new city. It wasn't a new city then, but that was its name. Yes. Mount Vesuvius is in the suburbs of Naples. Mount Vesuvius erupted, destroying Pompeii, and Nostradamus was predicting some kind of eruption of Vesuvius that would hit Naples. It was actually a reasonable prophecy to make, although it still hasn't come true, fortunately.
Yeah. Well, our time is up, Richard, but once again, a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
And thank you for being with us.